Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm the Muslim metaphysician, and today I'm here with a special episode to talk to you guys about why I became a Muslim. Alright, so I originally was raised in a Catholic family. I went to Catholic school for a few years when I was very young in kindergarten and first grade. Eventually we transitioned to a public school, but I was raised in a Catholic home. Pretty much my entire family is Roman Catholic, although they aren't very, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, they're not very serious practicing Catholics, but they do generally believe in the Catholic faith. In my early years, I went to what's called Sunday school, where I participated in religious classes from very early on up until about 8th grade. Now, the Catholic Church has a system of sacraments and things that you do. You have things like baptism, communion, and then later on they have something that's called confirmation, which basically happens when you're a young man or young woman. It's usually in 8th grade or going into freshman year of high school, so around 13 years old. At this stage, you get what's basically called confirmed into the Catholic Church. My story is quite interesting looking back on it now, because I was a little bit of a rebellious child, and it's interesting that the Catholic Church was willing to take my parents' money all the way up until confirmation, to where they weren't going to be able to get any more money out of us from Sunday school anyway. And at that point they decided that I was not ready to become confirmed into the Catholic Church, and they basically kicked me out of the Sunday school. So I never was actually confirmed into the Catholic Church. And it's interesting that I later became Muslim. So subhanallah, God is the best of planners. That's the way I see it. So kind of fast forwarding from there, after 13, I went into high school. I still kind of believed in God, but I never had faith in the Catholic tradition or Catholic faith as a whole. And a lot of it was due to that, but also many things didn't make sense to me, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what some of those things are. So for much of high school, I just generally believed in God, but I didn't have a religion that I practiced or anything that I aligned myself with in particular. In high school, though, I did meet a friend named Alex, or Alejandro, who is a Muslim. He was a Muslim, and he became one of my best friends in high school. Originally, we didn't talk too much about religion, but eventually he got around to speaking to me about Islam and the Qur'an and things like that. So he prompted me basically to start reading the Qur'an. So I started reading it in my mind that I was going to read this book and somehow refute it to my friend. I was going to refute my friend and his religion. But what wound up happening is that when I started reading the Qur'an, a lot of doubts that I had about the Catholic and Christian religion as a whole became cleared up. And the Qur'an somehow avoided much of the problems that I had with the Bible and the Christian faith, and just completely avoided those things and supplemented them with much better ideas and understandings. And some of those things that I'm referring to are, first of all, the way I see it is that the Christian faith is built on 3 fundamental doctrines. The first is the Trinity. So it's the idea that God is 3 in 1, 3 persons and 1 being. And I've gone over the Trinity before in much of my videos and explained why I think it's illogical. So if you guys want, you can go back to my previous videos, and I have a series ongoing right now about the illogical nature of the Trinity. The second thing is what's known as the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So it's the idea that the second person of the Trinity became man for a brief period, although right now he still does have his human body. So that also didn't make sense, how a being could both be fully God and fully man, truly God and truly man, and possess contradictory attributes. Now, I've also gone into a couple videos in my series on the incarnation, explaining in more detail why I think it's problematic and contradictory. And the third thing is the atonement. This is another fundamental pillar. It's the idea that an innocent man, Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, became a man and died on the cross for the sins of mankind. And so, for me, it didn't make sense, and I think even with the biblical portrayal, especially in the Old Testament, when you look at passages in Deuteronomy like that express the idea that the son shall not be put to death for the father, but each man will be put to death for his own sin, not for the sins of the other. And so for me, it didn't make much sense how an innocent man would be put to death for the sins of all of the guilty, and somehow that is the pinnacle of justice. For me, that seems to be the opposite of justice, that an innocent man should not be put to death for all of the sins of the guilty, and that somehow would appease God's wrath, and then he would have mercy on us. For me, that didn't make sense, and it still doesn't make sense. Now, what's the Quranic portrayal of these three things? First of all, the Quran explicitly rejects the idea of a Trinity. We believe in Tawheed, which is basically the uniqueness and the ultimate oneness of God. We worship and serve God alone, and we believe that God is not three persons in any way. He's just completely one. And now this is expressed in the Quran in chapter 112, Surah Ikhlas, verses 1 to 4, which says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. And so in this surah it says, say, He, Allah, is one. He is the eternal, or the self-sufficient, in verse number 2. Verse number 3, He begets not, nor is He begotten. And this is explicit denial of the idea that the Son was eternally begotten of the Father, like you find in the Nicene Creed and the Creed of Constantinople. The Quran is explicitly rejecting this doctrine. And the fourth verse says, and there's none like unto Him. So God is completely unique. Laysa kamithlihi shay. We do not compare anything with God. He is ultimately uncomparable in that sense. And so this is an explicit denial of what we would say the confusion with Christianity is. Okay, so that's the first thing, that it rejects the Trinity and it sets up a unique and undeniable oneness of God in the Quran, which makes much more sense and is in line with arguments that we give from natural theology for a creator God. The second thing, as I said, with the incarnation is, it just didn't make sense to me back then, and it still doesn't, and hence why I'm still making videos about it. But the Quran clearly rejects this. God does not have dual natures. He didn't come down in that way, and He's not truly God and truly man. It just completely rejects this idea. The third thing with the atonement is that the Quran completely rejects this as well. And over and over and over again, you'll find in the Quran, like a drum beat, that no man shall bear the burden of another. And this is in reference to the doctrine of the atonement that Christians apply, where they say that a single individual has taken the burden or the sins of mankind, and he was an innocent man, both in Islam and Christianity. And for us in the Quranic narrative is that no man shall bear the burden of another. So these are the three doctrines that I found most confusing while I was a Christian. And the Quran cleared up those three things fundamentally about who God is and what His purpose is and those kind of things. So those are the main reasons why I originally became a Muslim. Also, subsequently, since then, I have became to appreciate basically the miraculous nature of the Quran. And what do I mean by that? What is the miraculous nature of the Quran? Well, one of the ways that scholars speak about the miraculous nature of the Quran is its linguistic miracle, or the nature of its linguistics. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to give a couple examples, although I have to admit in this brief video, I can't do it justice. I'm just explaining to you my journey, why I became Muslim, and some reasons why I think Islam is the truth. So one example I'll give you is in the Quran, chapter 12, verse 54, and it's mentioned in Surah Yusuf, the chapter about Joseph's story, alayhi salam, in which basically what's mentioned there is a story in, it's very similar to the biblical narrative, although the key difference that I'm going to point to about the Quran's miraculous nature is the idea that when a particular individual is referenced in the story, he has a certain title that isn't used in the biblical narrative, and that title is Malik. So he is called a king. The individual that was speaking to Prophet Joseph in the story is referred to in the Quran as a Malik, as a king, instead of as a pharaoh as is portrayed in the biblical narratives. And why is this significant? It's significant because the title as pharaoh for an individual rather than just a court setting, okay, or the temple, however you want to phrase it, it was not used as a title for an individual until after figures like Abraham and Joseph. It then later became, sometime during the New Kingdom era, what they call the New Kingdom era, which was around the time of Moses, so Moses fits into that timeline. It became then a title that was used for an individual. So Pharaoh was not used as a title for an individual prior to the New Kingdom era, which is when Joseph existed, or is said to have existed. Okay, so what does the Quran do? If the Quran, as Christians and many other skeptics claim, just repeated stories from other sources, specifically many times the biblical narratives, then why didn't it repeat the same mistake and call the individual that Joseph was dealing with in the story, why didn't it call him Pharaoh? It didn't call him a Pharaoh, it called him a Malik, which is a king. Okay, so that's a significant thing, because now we know, going back into history, the historical evidence shows that that individual was not called a Pharaoh. They were called Maliks, or kings. And later on, after that period, then it became used as a title of a Pharaoh for a single individual. That's one linguistic miracle that I would speak of. The second, a second example is in Quran chapter 2, verse 143, Surah Baqarah. It calls the nation of the people of the Prophet, it calls us what's called the middle nation. Okay, and the word that's used in Arabic there refers to middle. Okay. So why is this significant? Well, it's significant because how many verses today are there in the second chapter of the Quran? There's 286 verses, or ayat, in that chapter, and the word middle appears exactly in the middle of that chapter. So there's 286 verses total, and in verse 143, the word middle is used. So the significance is that the word middle is used in the exact verse that's in the middle of the entire surah. Now, why? Let's add on to the miraculous understanding of why this is so amazing. The reason is because the Quran was revealed piecemeal over several years. Okay, so this surah and this surah as well was revealed piecemeal over several years. It wasn't just revealed all at once. Okay. The second thing is, it would be much easier for this quote unquote miracle to be performed if it was a written revelation, but originally all of this was oral. So that makes it even that more significant that all of it was oral, and yet this was able to be displayed as a miracle. Okay, the third thing is that the chapters and verse numbers, these sort of things, did not come into play and were not spoken of in that way until the Qur'an was reduced to writing and later verse numbers were applied. Just as people who are familiar with the biblical narrative, there were no originally a starting point and a stopping point of verse numbers. Okay, so it's even more miraculous that the author of the Qur'an, if you want to say it was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which we don't agree with, but for the sake of argument, if it was him, and he didn't even have verse numbers that he listed out in that way and written down, then how would he somehow fit it in exactly the middle of the surah in verse number 143? That doesn't really seem to add up. So that's the other part of it, is that there were no verse numbers and it was later reduced to writing and somehow fit exactly in the middle of the surah. So that's the second thing that I would say is part of the linguistic miraculous nature of the Qur'an. A third example is in the Qur'an chapter 33 verse 4, where it mentions that there cannot be two hearts in a man, and the word that it uses rajul, which means a man. It's not a term that is used for mankind as a whole. It's specifically to the male. Okay, now why is this somehow miraculous, or why is this significant? Well, because we know that when a woman gets pregnant, technically speaking, she could have two hearts within her, her own heart and then the heart of the baby. Or even if she had twins, she could have more than two hearts, right? So it's significant that the language of the Qur'an is very precise, and that's what I'm trying to get at with these examples, is that the language and word choices that the Qur'an uses is very precise. The first thing is that it uses the word for man instead of mankind, like nas or people or insan. It doesn't use the generic term for humans. It uses a specific term that that applies only to men. And that's significant, as I said, because a woman could have, technically speaking, more than two hearts within her at once. The second point is that over and over and over again, when the Qur'an mentions the hearts inside of us, it mentions inside the chest. But in this verse, it uses the word for body or interior as a whole, because of the fact that a woman could be pregnant and have a chest in her heart, but also then a chest in her belly. Okay, so this is, as I said, for the very same reasons, it's very important to understand that the precise word usage of the Qur'an is always at play. Okay, now this is just a brief description of what I mean by the linguistic miracle of the Qur'an. There are so many other examples that we can give and go through, and I can respond back and forth to objections to them. But this is just to give you an understanding of why I think the Qur'an is miraculous in some sense. Now, fast forwarding, going back to my story, now once I became Muslim, I became what's called a Qur'anist, Qur'an only, however you want to phrase it. Basically, I affirmed and believed in the Qur'an, but I rejected what's called the Sunnah or Hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason why I did that is because I was largely ignorant at the time. For many years, I couldn't understand what the necessity of the Sunnah was. And the Sunnah refers to the sayings, deeds, silent approvals, and actions that the Prophet, peace be upon him, performed. And why it goes hand in hand with the Qur'an. Now, in previous videos, I've explained what the problem is with the Qur'anist viewpoint and why it's not sufficient. There's several problems with it. The Qur'an, much of it just doesn't make sense without resourcing outside of itself in order to understand the historical context, in order to understand certain words in the Arabic language. There's just many things that we just wouldn't make sense without recourse to something outside of the Qur'an itself. And I don't want to go into much detail, but I'm just giving you a brief overview of my story and my journey to Islam. So I was a Qur'anist for many years, about 7-8 years, and then I started to have doubts about it, and I've spoken about it in the past due to things just not making sense anymore. I had to radically redefine things in the Qur'an to fit with my narrative, and I just couldn't hold the pieces together anymore. It didn't make sense. So about 2 years ago, I became a traditional Sunni, which means I now embrace the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so now I make videos attempting to explain why I think that former position is wrong. I've debated with people like Edip Yüksel, who is one of the prominent so-called scholars of the Qur'anist movement and representatives of it on his YouTube channel. So you guys are free to check that out if you wish. So now I'm a traditional Sunni, and now I make videos about all different kind of topics. I basically make videos about Christian theology, Muslim theology, general philosophy, and refuting positions that I think are false. So yeah, but I hope that this video was an introduction and explanation to why I became Muslim. As I said, the main reasons why I became Muslim was because of the theological positions and the coherence of the positions of the Qur'an about the oneness of God, about His prophets, about His books, and then also about the scripture, the miraculous nature of the Qur'an itself. And I gave some examples of this. I also explained my journey from Christianity in the beginning to Islam, and then from my Qur'anist understanding to a more traditional Sunni Islam that I have been in today for about 2 years now. It's been a blessing. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.